What if the city most of America drives straight past on the way to somewhere more famous has been quietly feeding the entire country for over 100 years? What if the cone in a child's hand at the fair, the cake on your weekend brunch menu, the soda sweating in your cooler, and the cheese on the pizza that people fight about on the internet were all born in the exact same place, on a single bend in the Mississippi River? What if St. Louis, a city the rest of the country tends to flatten into one silver arch and a baseball team, invented more of the way America actually eats than almost anywhere else on the map, and then somehow forgot to send the bill? Hi, my name is David, and this is Food Origins, the show where we pull back the curtain on the foods you grew up eating and find out they came from somewhere you never expected. If this is your first time here, hit that subscribe button, because today we are going all in on St. Louis. And I promise you, by the end of this video, you are never going to look at a simple ice cream cone the same way again. Here is what most people get wrong about St. Louis. They think of it as a stopover, a place between Chicago and the South, a city of breweries and highways and that one enormous arch. And yes, all of that is true. But for one specific, glorious stretch of American history, St. Louis was one of the most inventive food cities on the entire continent. It sat at the crossroads of the country, a place where German bakers lived next to Italian immigrants, who lived next to Sicilian grocers, who lived next to Chinese restaurant families, and somehow they all ended up feeding each other. And in 1904, the entire planet showed up on its doorstep for a World's Fair that, as you are about to see, behaved less like an exhibition and more like the single greatest food laboratory in human history. So let's get into it. 11 foods, one city, and a story that is going to completely rearrange the way you see the middle of the map. Food number 1, toasted ravioli. Let's start in a neighborhood. Not a restaurant, not a factory, a neighborhood. On the south side of St. Louis, there is a tight little grid of streets called the Hill, and for over a century, it has been the beating Italian heart of the city. Sicilian and Northern Italian families settled there, opened groceries and bakeries and red sauce restaurants, and built a food culture so dense and so proud that you can practically smell the garlic from the highway. And it was here, sometime in the 1940s, that one of America's great accidental appetizers was born. The story, and there are several competing versions because every restaurant on the Hill wants the credit for this one, goes something like this. A cook in the kitchen of one of those neighborhood spots was making ravioli. Now, ravioli is supposed to go into boiling water. That is the entire job. But this cook, depending on who is telling it, was either distracted, a little clumsy, or possibly a little drunk, and instead of dropping the ravioli into the pot of water, dropped it into a vat of hot oil. By the time anyone noticed, the pasta had puffed and crisped into a golden, blistered, crunchy little pillow. A disaster. A waste of perfectly good ravioli. Except somebody tasted it, and somebody dusted it with Parmesan cheese and slid a bowl of marinara next to it for dipping. And that mistake became toasted ravioli. Crispy on the outside, molten meat and cheese on the inside, served by the basketful with red sauce. Here is the detail that surprises people. Toasted ravioli is now so completely woven into Missouri's identity that it functions as the unofficial state appetizer. You will find it on menus across the entire Midwest. But almost nobody outside the region knows that it was invented by a clumsy hand in a tiny Italian kitchen on the Hill. A piece of pasta fell into the wrong pot, and a regional institution was born. And honestly, that is going to be a theme today. St. Louis has a genius for inventing things entirely by accident. Food number 2, the ice cream cone. Now we arrive at 1904, and the event that is going to keep coming up over and over in this video, the Louisiana Purchase Exposition, better known as the St. Louis World's Fair. 20 million visitors, 1,200 acres, an entire gleaming white city built inside a city for 7 months. And the food. The food that came out of that fair changed the way the entire planet snacks. We are going to visit it several times today, and by the third visit, you're going to start wondering, like I did, whether the 1904 World's Fair was actually a fair at all, or just an elaborate cover story for the greatest run of food invention in American history? It starts with the ice cream cone. Now, I have to be honest with you, because intellectual honesty matters on this channel. The cone is a contested invention. There were patents for edible ice cream containers floating around before the fair. There were waffle makers in several countries. So I am not going to tell you St. Louis invented the concept of putting ice cream on pastry out of thin air. What I am going to tell you is where the cone became the cone, where it exploded from a curiosity into the default way an entire civilization eats frozen dessert. The most beloved version of the story belongs to a Syrian immigrant named Ernest Hamwi. Hamwi was working a stall at the fair, selling zalabia, a crisp, sweet Middle Eastern waffle pastry. Right next to him was an ice cream vendor doing a roaring business on a brutally hot Missouri summer day. So much business, in fact, that the vendor ran completely out of the little dishes he served his ice cream in. He was stuck. He had ice cream and no way to hand it to anyone. Hamwi looked over, took one of his fresh, hot waffles, and rolled it into a cone. He let it cool just long enough to hold its shape, and the ice cream man dropped a scoop right on top. The crowd lost their minds. By the end of the fair, vendors all over the grounds were rolling waffles into cones. The portable, drip-proof, eat-it-and-throw-nothing-away ice cream cone walked out of St. Louis in the summer of 1904 and never came back. A man selling a pastry that almost nobody in America had heard of accidentally solved a problem for the guy next door and gave the world its most recognizable image of summer.
Food number 3. Gooey butter cake.
If the ice cream cone was a happy accident at a glamorous World's Fair, this next one is a happy accident in a sweaty little bakery, and I think I love it even more for that. Gooey butter cake is the most St. Louis dessert that has ever existed, and like so much of this city's food, it was born from a mistake nobody meant to make. Picture a German-American bakery on the south side of St. Louis in the 1930s. The Depression is on. Nothing can be wasted, ever. And a baker is mixing up a standard batch of cake batter when he gets his proportions catastrophically wrong. The most repeated version says he reversed the amounts of 2 key ingredients, using far too much butter and sugar and not nearly enough flour. What came out of the oven did not rise the way it was supposed to. It collapsed into a dense, sticky, almost custardy slab with a gooey, gloriously underbaked center and a thin, crackly top dusted in powdered sugar. By every rule of professional baking, this was a failure. You do not sell a cake that did not rise. But it was the Depression. And you also do not throw away an entire tray of butter and sugar. So he sold it. And people did not just buy it. They came back. They asked for it by name. They wanted the broken cake, the gooey one, the mistake. Gooey butter cake became a St. Louis obsession that has never once faded. Walk into a bakery anywhere in the city today, and it is sitting right there in the case, golden and sticky and a little bit obscene, a monument to the idea that the best thing in the room is sometimes the thing that went wrong. Necessity is the mother of invention, but in St. Louis, it is starting to look like clumsiness is the father. Food number 4, cotton candy. Back to the fair, because we are nowhere near done with 1904. Close your eyes and picture a carnival, a state fair, a circus midway. Now picture the single most iconic food in that entire scene. It is pink, it is spun, it is roughly the size of a child's head, and it dissolves into pure sugar the second it touches your tongue. Cotton candy. And here is the part that I find genuinely perfect. Cotton candy, that glorious monument to sugar and tooth decay, was co-invented and unleashed on the world by a dentist. His name was William Morrison, and yes, he was a practicing dentist. Along with a candy maker named John C. Wharton, he built an electric machine that melted sugar and then flung it through tiny holes, where it caught the air and instantly hardened into delicate, feather-light threads. They called their creation fairy floss, and the place they chose to introduce it to the public was, of course, the 1904 St. Louis World's Fair. It was a sensation. They sold something in the neighborhood of 68,000 boxes of fairy floss at that fair, at 25 cents a box, which at the time was half the price of admission to the entire fair. Read that again. People were paying half the cost of getting through the front gate just to eat spun sugar out of a little wooden box. The name changed to cotton candy later on, but the invention, the electric spinning, the airy pink cloud, the whole experience. All of that walked out of St. Louis. A dentist gave the world a snack that has personally funded the careers of every dentist who came after him. I think about that more than is probably healthy. Food number 5, iced tea. I told you the 1904 World's Fair was going to keep coming back, and here it is again. Because at this point, I am fully convinced that fair was just a 7-month-long episode of this show that nobody bothered to film. This time, the invention is something so ordinary, so quietly woven into American life, that you have probably never once stopped to ask where it came from. Iced tea. Now, in the interest of that intellectual honesty I keep promising you, recipes for tea served cold did exist before 1904. You can find them in 19th century cookbooks. So I am not going to claim St. Louis invented the physical act of putting tea on ice. What St. Louis did, what that fair did, was take iced tea from a niche regional curiosity and blast it straight into the bloodstream of the entire nation in a single summer. The story belongs to a man named Richard Bleckenden, an Englishman who had come to the fair to promote hot tea from India. He had a problem. It was a Missouri summer. The kind of wet, heavy, oppressive heat that makes you question every decision that led you there. And not a single soul wandering those fairgrounds wanted a steaming cup of hot tea. His booth was dying. So Bleckenden did the only thing a desperate man can do. He dumped his hot tea over a pile of ice and served it cold. And the overheated, sweating, miserable crowds drank it as fast as he could pour it. By the time the fair closed, iced tea was no longer a curiosity. It was an American default. And while I am here, let me say this. The list of foods that the 1904 World's Fair gets credited with launching or popularizing is honestly absurd. Hamburgers on a bun, hot dogs, peanut butter, even Dr. Pepper's national debut. The claims pile up so high that food historians spend careers untangling them. At a certain point, you stop calling it a World's Fair and start calling it the place where America wrote its menu. Food number 6, 7-Up. Let's leave the fair for a moment and jump forward a couple of decades to 1929 and to one of the strangest origin stories on this entire list. Because the lemon lime soda sitting in gas station coolers across the planet, the one in the green bottle, was invented in St. Louis by a man named Charles Leeper Grigg, and its original name was not 7-Up. Its original name was, and I want you to brace yourself for this, Bib Label Lithiated Lemon Lime Soda. That is a real name. That was printed on a real bottle. And the word lithiated in that name is not decorative. The original formula contained lithium citrate, a mood-stabilizing compound that is, to this very day, used as a genuine psychiatric medication. For its first 2 decades, the cheerful little soda you might have poured over ice on a hot afternoon contained an actual pharmaceutical drug. The lithium was not quietly removed from the formula until 1948. And the timing of the launch is almost too good to be true. Grigg released his lemon lime soda in St. Louis in October of 1929. If that month rings a bell, it should. Just a couple of weeks later, the stock market collapsed and the Great Depression began. A brand new soda company, launching a strange medicinal beverage with a name nobody could pronounce, days before the worst economic catastrophe in modern history. By every law of business, it should have died in the crib. Instead, it survived, mercifully simplified its name to the far catchier 7-Up, and grew into one of the best-selling soft drinks on Earth. Nobody fully agrees on where the name came from, which feels exactly right for a drink that started its life as a mood-altering medicine. A lithium soda, born 2 weeks before the Depression, in a St. Louis storefront. You could not write that. Food number 7, St. Louis-style pizza. Okay, I need everyone to stay calm, because we are about to step on a landmine, and the landmine is made of cheese. St. Louis has its own style of pizza, and it is one of the most fiercely debated regional foods in the entire country. People do not feel neutral about this pizza. They either defend it like family, or they recoil from it on sight. And the thing that sits at the absolute center of the controversy is a cheese that, like nearly everything else today, was invented right here. The cheese is called Provel. And Provel is not really a cheese in the way your Italian grandmother would recognize. It is a processed blend, combining cheddar, Swiss, and provolone into something with a deliberately low melting point. It does not stretch. It does not give you that long, dramatic cheese pull. Instead, it goes soft and gooey and almost buttery, melting into a smooth white blanket across the top of the pizza. It was developed specifically for St. Louis, and you will genuinely struggle to find it anywhere else in America. Now put that cheese on the rest of the formula. The crust is cracker thin, unleavened, crisp enough to snap like a chip, with no chewy puffed edge anywhere in sight. The whole thing is cut not into wedges, but into little squares, what locals call the tavern cut, or the party cut. The most famous name in the game is Emo's, founded by Ed and Margie Emo in 1964, a pizzeria so beloved that the people of St. Louis affectionately call it the square beyond compare. To an outsider raised on New York slices or Chicago deep dish, St. Louis pizza can look like an act of pure provocation. To a St. Louisan, it is home. And whether you love it or hate it, you cannot deny what it represents. This city looked at pizza, the most universal food on the entire planet, and built a version that exists nowhere else and answers to absolutely no one. That is not a footnote. That is confidence. Food number 8, the slinger. Every great food city has a dish that only truly makes sense at 2 o'clock in the morning. A dish designed not for fine dining, but for the specific, urgent needs of a person who has made some questionable decisions over the course of an evening and now needs to be physically put back together. In St. Louis, that dish is the slinger, and it is a magnificent, towering, heart-stopping pile of everything. Here is what arrives when you order one. On the bottom, a bed of hash brown potatoes. On top of that, 2 eggs, usually fried. On top of those, a hamburger patty, sometimes 2. And then the whole architectural marvel gets buried, drowned, smothered under a heavy ladle of thick chili con carne. Then it is finished off with a blanket of shredded cheese and a scatter of raw chopped onions. It is breakfast, lunch, and dinner stacked onto a single plate and dared to be eaten in one sitting. The slinger was born in the diners and all-night greasy spoons of St. Louis in the middle of the 20th century, in legendary institutions like the Eat Right Diner, places that ran around the clock and fed the night shift workers, the bar crowd, and the brokenhearted. The genius of the slinger is that it is not trying to impress a single person. It is the exact opposite of a tasting menu. It is a working-class invention built on the same logic as half the foods on this list. Take cheap, filling ingredients, combine them with zero pretension, and feed somebody who really, genuinely needs it. The slinger is St. Louis food in its purest form. Loud, generous, completely unbothered, and exactly what it needs to be. Food number 9, the St. Paul sandwich. This is the one that surprises people the most, and honestly, it surprises me every single time I talk about it, which is exactly why I am putting it right here near the end. Because there is a sandwich you can order in St. Louis that you essentially cannot find anywhere else in America, and it has the single most misleading name on this entire list. It is called the St. Paul sandwich, and the first thing you need to know is that it has nothing to do with St. Paul, Minnesota. The second thing you need to know is that it is a Chinese-American invention, and it lives almost exclusively inside the Chinese-American restaurants of St. Louis. Here's what it actually is. You take an egg foo young patty, that fried pancake of eggs, bean sprouts, onions, and minced meat, and you place it between 2 slices of plain, soft, white American sandwich bread. You add mayonnaise, dill pickle slices, lettuce, and tomato. That is the St. Paul sandwich. A Cantonese-American egg dish dressed up like an all-American deli sandwich and sold from the very same counter as your fried rice and your crab rangoon. The origin is a little hazy, which feels appropriate for a dish this unlikely. The most common story credits a St. Louis restaurant owner who named it after his hometown, which may or may not have actually been St. Paul, Minnesota. What is not hazy at all is the geography. This sandwich is a true St. Louis original, a head-on collision of 2 completely different food cultures pressed together between 2 slices of white bread, and it stayed almost entirely within the city limits. You will not find it reviewed in national magazines. You will not find it on a tourist trail. But it is there, on hundreds of takeout menus across the city, and it is one of the clearest examples of what St. Louis does best. taking the food cultures that arrive within its borders and producing something that belongs entirely and only to itself. Food number 10, the Gerber sandwich. Stay in the sandwich world with me, because St. Louis has another one, and this one comes with a name, a date, and an actual man it was named after. The Gerber sandwich is an open-faced, broiled creation, and despite the name, it has nothing whatsoever to do with baby food. It has to do with a regular customer and a deli that decided to make him a legend. The Gerber was created in 1973 at a place called Ruma's Deli in St. Louis. The story goes that the owners built an open-faced sandwich on Italian or Vienna garlic bread, layered it with ham, topped it with that St. Louis staple, Provel cheese, dusted the whole thing with a sprinkle of paprika for color, and ran it under the broiler until the cheese went gooey and the edges crisped. Then they needed a name, and a regular customer named Dick Gerber happened to be the inspiration, so they simply named the sandwich after him. That is it. That is the entire origin. A man walked into his neighborhood deli often enough that they immortalized him forever in melted Provel. Here is why I love this one so much. It is such a perfectly St. Louis sandwich. It uses Provel, the city's own invented cheese, which means the Gerber could not truly exist anywhere else, because the key ingredient barely exists anywhere else. It is humble, it is regional, it is named after an ordinary guy, and it has been quietly served in St. Louis delis for over 50 years. Most of the country has never heard of it. The people of St. Louis order it without thinking twice. That gap between a food's fame and its genius is the entire reason this show exists. Food number 11, frozen custard and the concrete. And we end where every great food story should end, with dessert, on a warm night, standing in a line that wraps all the way around the building. Because St. Louis did not just embrace frozen custard, it perfected it, and then it invented a way of serving it so absurd, so openly defiant of physics, that it became a civic identity all its own. Frozen custard is not ice cream. The difference is egg yolk, which gives it a denser, richer, silkier texture than ordinary ice cream could ever dream of managing. And in St. Louis, frozen custard means one name above all others: Ted Drewes. The original Ted Drewes opened in St. Louis back in 1930, and one of its locations sits right on the old Route 66, which means for decades it has fed not just the city, but everyone passing through on America's most famous highway. But the real invention, the thing that made Ted Drewes a genuine legend, came in 1959. They created something called the concrete, a frozen custard so impossibly thick that when they hand it to you upside down. The cup is inverted, the spoon points straight at the ground, and not a single drop falls out. The story goes that it was created to prove a point about exactly how thick the custard really was, and the proof became the product. To this very day, ordering a concrete at Ted Drewes comes with a little ceremony of watching it handed over upside down. A small daily miracle performed on a street corner in St. Louis. A city took a dessert, made it richer than anyone else dared to, and then turned the laws of gravity into a marketing gimmick that has lasted over 60 years. 11 foods, one city, and a story that most of the country has been driving straight past for over 100 years without ever knowing it was there. St. Louis is not just an arch. It is not just a baseball team and a brewery and a stop on the way to somewhere else. Look at this list: toasted ravioli, the ice cream cone, gooey butter cake, cotton candy, iced tea, 7-Up, an entire style of pizza, the slinger, the St. Paul sandwich, the Gerber, and a frozen custard so thick it is served upside down. That is not a footnote in American food history. That is a chapter. That is a city sitting at the crossroads of the country that quietly, accidentally, and brilliantly invented the way an enormous part of America snacks, drinks, and indulges, and then watch the credit drift off down the highway to flashier towns. That is what Food Origins is all about. The hidden story underneath the familiar thing. The moment you realize that the cone in your hand or the soda in your fridge has a history far stranger and far more local than you ever imagined. So if this changed the way you see St. Louis, or the way you see that ice cream cone you had last summer, hit that like button and subscribe, because we have stories exactly like this one lined up for cities and cuisines that are going to completely rearrange the way you see your plate. And tell me in the comments which one of these 11 surprised you the most. I have a feeling it is going to be the lithium soda, but I have been wrong before. I'm David. This is Food Origins. I'll see you in the next one.